Have you ever stopped to think maybe the headlines we see every day about Iran, maybe they're missing something, like a whole different angle?
hmm
What if there's another way entirely to look at this, this whole complex situation, one that really challenges what we usually hear?
It's a really important question to ask.
Exactly. So today we're doing a deep dive into exactly that. We're looking specifically at the Chinese perspective on all this sustained pressure the U.S. and Israel are putting on Iran.
A viewpoint you don't often get foregrounded in Western media.
Right. And our sources, they offer this unique, maybe crucial viewpoint. It's kind of a shortcut almost to understanding the different layers here.
Absolutely.
So our mission today, let's try to distill the key arguments,
Yeah.
really get a handle on China's thinking, its rationale, and figure out what this alternative view might mean for, global stability.
And understanding this perspective, it's really vital if you want to be genuinely well-informed on international relations today. It highlights principles, strategic interests, things that often get missed if you're stuck in just one narrative.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Where do we start? What's the sort of foundational Chinese philosophy guiding how they see the U.S. and Israeli approach to Iran? How does Beijing frame this whole thing?
Well, fundamentally, Beijing's position is built on its core ideas: peaceful coexistence, mutual respect for sovereignty, and crucially, non-interference in other countries' internal business.
Okay.
So from China's viewpoint, this aggressive stance from Washington and Tel Aviv, the military threats, the political pressure, they see it as a kind of dangerous step backward, a return to unilateralism, maybe even gunboat diplomacy, basically using power to force your will.
Right, imposing your way.
Exactly. And they believe this doesn't just stir things up in the Middle East, it actually weakens the whole global multilateral system that China really supports and wants to build on.
That's fascinating. And it seems this broader philosophy, it completely changes how China views Iran itself. It's not the pariah state narrative we often hear.
Not at all.
So what's the insight there for China? Why do they see Iran as, quote, a key regional power and an important partner for things like trade, energy, and this idea of Eurasian integration, especially when that view is so different from the West's?
Yeah, and that's really where it gets interesting, isn't it? For China, Iran isn't just some isolated issue to be managed. It's seen as a strategically vital piece in their bigger vision for a more integrated, multipolar world. Calling Iran a key regional power fits right into China's long-term goals, both geopolitical and economic.
Okay.
They see Iran as a potential bridge for connecting Europe and Asia, not just a state that needs to be contained or isolated.
So it completely reframes their strategy for the region and maybe even globally,
Yeah.
sets it apart from, say, a purely security-focused approach you might see elsewhere.
Absolutely. It's a fundamentally different starting point.
Okay, so this foundational view on sovereignty, non-interference, it leads us naturally to a really critical and often contentious area, nuclear nonproliferation. How does that core philosophy shape China's view on applying those rules, especially to Iran?
Right. Well, Beijing definitely recognizes that nuclear nonproliferation is important globally. No question there.
Sure.
But from their perspective, the way these rules have been applied to Iran looks, well, selective and politicized.
Oh, so.
Well, look at Iran. It's actually a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. That's the main global agreement trying to stop the spread of nukes and promote peaceful nuclear energy.
Right.
And Tehran has consistently said its program is for peaceful energy. China, remember, was part of the group, the P5+1, that signed the Iran nuclear deal,
Yeah.
the JCPOA.
The deal the U.S. later pulled out of.
Exactly. Beijing saw the JCPOA as a major diplomatic achievement. So from their viewpoint, the unilateral U.S. withdrawal back in 2018 wasn't just walking away from a deal. It was a breach of international consensus and really a key factor that triggered the current escalation we're seeing.
Yeah, and then you put that right next to Israel,
Yeah.
which is, widely believed to have nuclear weapons, isn't part of the NPT, refuses to sign it,
Right.
yet faces basically no comparable pressure or inspections from the West. From China's perspective, what does that stark contrast do to the credibility of this rules-based international order that the U.S. championed?
Well, from China's vantage point, it seriously damages that credibility.
Yeah.
They really stress that the principle of non-discrimination is, like, essential for international nuclear governance to work.
Right.
Meaning, for Beijing, all countries have got to be treated equally under international law. If you start applying rules differently depending on who the country is, well, then the whole system risks looking less like impartial law and more like, a tool used by powerful countries for their own geopolitical aims. It loses legitimacy.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's shift gears slightly to the more practical side of the pressure, the actual military actions and the economic sanctions. What's China's consistent line on their foreign policy stance?
China's foreign policy is pretty consistent here.
Mm-hmm.
They oppose military aggression and they oppose unilateral sanctions. Simple as that. Invincible.
And specifically regarding Iran.
They view the ongoing Israeli airstrikes, U.S. operations targeting Iranian interests.
Mm.
They see these as illegal under international law and just inherently destabilizing for the whole region.
And the reasons behind that stance, is it just principles or?
Oh, it's very pragmatic and strategic, too.
Yeah.
China has huge economic and energy interests right across the Middle East. You can't ignore that.
Yeah.
Iran, specifically, is seen as a key hub, a node, in their Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
Their massive global infrastructure plan. Plus, Iran's a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO.
Okay.
So any conflict involving Iran directly threatens things China cares deeply about. Regional supply chains, global oil prices that affects everyone, and the safety of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, which is critical.
So it's about their own interests, too, not just abstract principles.
Absolutely. It's intertwined, which
Yeah.
is why Beijing consistently calls for peaceful dialogue, for de-escalation. They urge everyone involved to, avoid provocations and stick to the rules set out in the UN Charter.
And what about the economic weapon, the U.S. sanctions regime against Iran, especially those secondary sanctions that can hit, say, Chinese companies doing business with Tehran? How does Beijing react to that?
Yeah, that's a major point of friction. China sees the U.S. sanctions regime, especially the secondary sanctions targeting their firms, as a direct violation of Chinese sovereignty
Right.
and also a violation of World Trade Organization norms.
So they just reject it.
Pretty much. Beijing explicitly does not accept what's called extraterritorial jurisdiction imposed by the U.S. Congress. Basically, they reject the idea that one country can just apply its own laws outside its borders to other countries' businesses.
Okay.
Their position is clear. If you're going to have sanctions, they need to be legitimate. And for them, that means approved by the United Nations Security Council, where China has a veto, not just dictated unilaterally by one nation.
So what does this all mean then, this rejection of unilateral sanctions, this focus on sovereignty? What are the implications for global economic stability, international law?
Well, it signaled a fundamental disagreement about how international economic and legal rules should work. China's concerned about the erosion of multilateral institutions like the UN and the WTO. They see unilateral actions, especially sanctions with extraterritorial reach, as undermining global trade stability and creating legal uncertainty. It challenges the U.S.-led approach directly.
Okay. So beyond the immediate conflicts and sanctions, how does China view Iran strategically? You mentioned the BRI, the SCO. What's the sort of longer-term, perhaps more collaborative side of this relationship that maybe we don't hear as much about?
Right. It's not all about managing conflict. China definitely views Iran as an important independent partner, especially now with the world becoming more polarized.
Why independent?
Because Iran pursues its own foreign policy path, it isn't aligned with the West in the way some other regional powers are. And of course, Iran is incredibly rich in resources, oil, gas, even rare earth minerals. That makes it a really crucial piece of China's long-term strategy for energy security.
And there was that big deal signed a few years back.
Exactly. The 25-year Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, signed in 2021, that was a big signal. It basically laid out a roadmap for much deeper cooperation in everything from trade and infrastructure to technology and even defense dialogue. And look at Iran joining groups like BRICS Plus and the SKO. For Beijing, this is all part of what they see as a shifting world order, a shift where countries in the global south are finding new ways to work together, asserting more agency outside the traditional Western-dominated frameworks.
So far from wanting to isolate Iran, China's actually pushing for its integration into these global frameworks, believing that promotes development and dialogue over, confrontation.
Precisely. That's the core idea. Bring them into the system, foster economic ties, encourage dialogue. It's the opposite of a containment strategy. Their actions, like supporting Iran's membership in these groups, reflect that belief.
Is there a concrete example where we've seen this Chinese diplomatic approach actually work in the region, something tangible?
Yes, definitely. A prime example, and one China was very proud of, was their role in brokering that historic détente, the restoration of diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran back in 2023.
Right, that made headlines.
It did. And it was widely seen as a real win for diplomacy over decades of rivalry. It showcased China's ability to act as a mediator using its soft power and its relatively neutral position in some of these regional disputes.
So contrasting that with how they might view other approaches.
Oh, the contrast they draw is stark. Their vision, they'd say, is about inclusive development, not setting up exclusionary alliances. It's about creating platforms for dialogue, not launching drone strikes. It's about aiming for long-term peace through mutual respect, not pushing for regime change or propping up specific regimes with arms sales and military bases, which, from Beijing's perspective, is what some Western powers have historically done, often escalating tensions.
Okay, so if we try to wrap this up, the core takeaway from the Chinese perspective seems to be that this whole U.S. and Israeli campaign against Iran, it's not just about Iran. It's seen more as a symptom, maybe, of a world order that's in crisis, one they think is stuck in, like, outdated Cold War thinking, too much militarism and autocracy.
That sums it up pretty well. And their response, their counterproposal, if you like, is to advocate for a new international order, one based on principles like equality between nations, mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and what they call win-win cooperation.
And Iran's place in that.
Beijing's view is firm. Iran shouldn't be punished for wanting to assert its independence. Instead, it should be welcomed into global economic and diplomatic systems. They believe stability comes from integration, from giving countries a stake in the system, not from isolation and pressure.
So ultimately, China's prescription is multilateral diplomacy, economic integration, and maybe strategic patience, believing that's the only path to a stable, prosperous Middle East, one that isn't constantly living under the shadow of intervention and war.
Exactly. And as the world clearly shifts towards multipolarity, more centers of power, not just one China is positioning itself. They want to be seen as a responsible global player, one that promotes peace, stability, and development for everyone, not domination through force.
Which leaves us with a pretty big question to think about.
It does. As this global landscape keeps shifting, keeps reconfiguring, what does it actually mean for the future of international relations, for stability, when the old ways of projecting power are being increasingly challenged by this very different vision of how the world should work? Something definitely worth considering.
Subscribe for more.